Hey everyone, it's Lauren back with episode 6 of the Depolarizers podcast, where we talk to those who are effectively working to depolarize our politics. In this episode, we have Yair Zivan, author of The Center Must Hold. Yair makes a case for a strong center with the values and the principles that allow for a liberal democracy to fight extremism. Thanks for joining, and let's get into it. Yair, it's so good to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, good to see you again. I was so lucky, y'all, to be able to meet Yair when he came to DC a few weeks ago for his book tour, which we'll get into about his book. But thank you for joining us for the conversation because when I was able to hear about your book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so perfect for the Depolarizers. So I'm really grateful that we got to talk about it.
Likewise, it was great. It was good to meet you, and it was a good trip to the US. I was there at an interesting time.
Yeah, truly interesting. So let's just go ahead and get into it. Your book is called The Center Must Hold. I have it here, which is super exciting, and I'm really grateful to have a copy of it. So can you talk about what inspired you to start the project that created this book? Because it's not just your writing, obviously, it's other people. So what inspired you for this book?
So the book, like you say, it's a collection of essays by leading centrist thinkers, writers, politicians, policymakers from all over the world. And it truly is a global effort. And there's some really fantastic contributors in there who I'm very grateful to for all adding their voices into it. I felt for a long time two things, I guess, that to me were always seemed obvious, but I wasn't sure that they'd ever been put together in one place, and felt more and more urgent. I think in the last few years, certainly where I live in Israel, but actually globally. And those two things were, one, that there is a thing called political centrism, that you can identify that it has a set of values, that you can put it together and it can make sense. And it works globally, and it's been around for a while. And the second is that if that thing exists and it's possible to articulate it in a coherent and effective way, then it is the best political answer to the extremism, populism, and polarization that is tearing apart much of the democratic world. And I guess that's kind of what connects between us, between what you're trying to do with this podcast and the work of the book, which is the center is a solution to one of the greatest challenges that I think we're facing, which is increased polarization in our societies. Not because the center is the place where everybody comes together on the lowest common denominator, but because it creates a different type of politics that I think is more effective and more productive, which lowers the levels of polarization in society.
And I love that you mentioned the center is not just the place where people come together, because I think I have a quote from your book here. You say centrism is not the middle point between two ever more extreme tribes on the left and right. Centrism sets the agenda that others must respond to, and so becomes a driving focal point of politics. So why is it important that centrism becomes this focal point versus just being like the place where people land, essentially? Because I think that you make a really good job of distinguishing those two things.
Yeah, so I think for me the distinction is between centrism as an idea, and there are some values and principles which I think make up what political centrism is. We can talk about them a bit more later if we've got time, but things like a really deep commitment to liberal democracy and the institutions and the principles that make up liberal democracy: free press, an independent Supreme Court, strong civil society, those sorts of factors that make liberal democracy more than just an idea and actually make it the most successful form of government that we've had. What we talk about in terms of liberal patriotism, a love of your country in a positive way rather than a nationalism that is inevitably about hating the other or putting other people down. And part of it is about the embrace of complexity and nuance, those words that have kind of shifted out of political favor and seem to be words that people back away from, which are actually words that centrists embrace, and I think we should embrace. They're words that make our politics better. So compromise, nuance, complexity. That is entirely different to the middle. The middle is a place where you split the difference. And the problem with the middle is always that it shifts according to where the left or the right or whichever groups in society are dominant are dragging the political discourse. And as one part of the map becomes more extreme, whether we go further and further to the right, as is happening in some countries, or further and further to the left, as we're seeing in other countries, the middle gets dragged around with them. And so rather than creating an alternative, it actually just enhances the problem. So I think for me, one of the key things about this book, and I think it comes out a lot, and one of the points that I've been trying to get across whenever I've had a chance to talk about it, is the difference between a middle point, which I don't put down as a political tactic that sometimes people use in order to get votes. There's nothing wrong with wanting to get votes and wanting to get elected and winning. That's all positive. But that is not the same as a political idea, which has its own core roots and positions and principles that you can rally around and which can set the tone of the political debate.
Absolutely. So can you talk more about in your book you note that I'm going to read it again, the antidote to extremism and sustained attacks on liberal democracy is the center. Why do you think it is essentially the solution for fighting extremism?
So first of all, I think it's worth just taking a moment just to define what we mean when we talk about extremists and populists, and then it explains why the center is the place that responds. Extremists are essentially trying to tear down our system. It's not An extremist is not somebody who has views I don't like or I think are slightly out there. It's okay. That's a good part of the democratic system. It's good for people to have a wide range of views. We should be able to tolerate them. We should be able to deal with them. We should be able to take them on and challenge them and defeat them if they're bad ideas. They're not necessarily extremists. Extremists are people who are trying to tear down our system and trying to break down the fundamentals of what makes our democracy work. And populists are the people in society today that inevitably divide us into two groups. There's always an us and a them, an in group and an out group, real patriots against immigrants, or the elites against the working class. And there's always this fight between the two groups. And I am always the authentic representative of the class that is downtrodden, the group that is downtrodden and mistreated, irrespective of whether that's a reflection of reality or not. So those two terms I think are important. And why is centrism the solution to it? Because centrism avoids the trap that the left and the right fall into. There are essentially two ways to fight extremism. One is to say, I'll try and appease them as much as I can. I'll go towards them to keep them happy. I won't go what I consider to be too far, and eventually I'll moderate them because they'll see that there's a reasonable option either on the fringes of the far right or the fringes of the far left. And that never works. That option always fails. And it fails because extremists are so committed to their cause that they will never moderate. They drag you towards where they want the debate to be. They pull us further apart, and they inevitably lead to more extremism. More extremism. So that idea is always going to fail. The alternative is to say, actually, here is the set of values. And honestly, the reason is, to put it quite bluntly, that the center is the place that is the antidote to the extremism, is because I don't trust the left and the right to do that job. Because you see, take an example like free speech, a fundamental part of liberal democracy, and the essay on free speech in the book, I think, goes as close to free speech absolutism as I think you would find in much of the world today, in a way that I think is really important. I want people to be able to express views, and a whole wide range of them. The right has taken free speech and said free speech is a right-wing issue because we're getting shut down, we're getting censored, and we're going to be the ones that champion free speech. And that's true all the way up until books they don't like, and then they're banning them in libraries. And so I just don't trust the political fringes, the edges of the political system, to do the job that the center does of actually defending the institutions of liberal democracy. That's true about challenging issues like an independent Supreme Court, which doesn't always rule the way that you like. It's true about an independent media and a free press that writes things you don't like. How do you defend those things, defend those institutions, even when you disagree with them? And that is something that the center is uniquely placed to do. And that's why it's the antidote, the real antidote to the extremism that we're seeing in so much of society.
Yeah. And so one thing I feel like I need to flesh out here is understanding what the center looks like in the context of a two-party system, right? So like you guys, or not you guys, but you know that we work on basically the center left of the Democratic Party. So like we work to build a strong, coherent center left faction of the Democratic Party because we work within the context of a two-party system. But you're saying like the center needs to be its own thing, essentially. One, do you have examples of what that's looked like in some of the work that you've done in other countries? And two, what do you think it could look like here in America if we decide to, essentially apply these tactics?
Sure. So I think centrism in and of itself has to be an idea that in the American system, in a two-party system like the United States, crosses over both of the parties. I think there is room for centrism in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and I think the last thing Americans need is a foreigner coming and telling them the best way to run their political system. The idea of centrism in a two-party system is to say we should be building big, strong centrist factions on both sides that can then turn around to their leaders and say, hey, if you want to get anything done, you're going to need our faction in the party just actually a lot more than you need the fringes of the party. And without us, you won't be able to govern. There's a great book in the UK context, and the UK is not strictly a two-party system in the same way. You have a very large and quite centrist Liberal Democrat Party today. But there's a great book about the case for the centre-right, which makes that case for the Conservative Party, right, which is the sister party of the Republicans in the United States. So I think it can work in a two-party system. In a multi-party system, like in Israel, where I live, and countries in Europe, what you can do is you can create a centrist party and you can drive it into the heart of the political system and you can make it a core part of the political system. So obviously, the most prominent example being Emmanuel Macron in France, won 2 terms as president of France in a centrist party that he created and drove into the heart of the French political system. Here in Israel, Yair Zivan, the head of the party that I work for, Yesh Atid, and my boss for the last decade, created a centrist political party and said, this is what we're going to now do in Israeli politics. We're going to define a political center, not a political middle. We're not always in the middle of the political map. These are our values. These are our principles. Those have been incredibly consistent, I think, over the last decade. And that creates a longevity. And look, the measure of a seriousness of a political idea is not whether it wins every election. It's whether it can consistently deliver, learn from its mistakes, win after spending time in opposition. And I think there are plenty of examples where that works and where that's worked well. There's a party in Austria, slightly smaller, but a party in Austria called NEOS, which I think is a great example of this. The FDP in Germany has long been a centrist voice, centrist liberal voice in German politics. So there are lots of examples where this has been successful, and it works in both systems. One of the things in a two-party system is that you will find at times, if you guys work on the center left of the Democratic Party, you will find more in common at times with the center right of the Republican Party than with the left of your own party. You will find times when you have more agreement with them than you do with the fringes of your own party. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to create one political party in the center. It's good that there are strong centrist factions fighting on both sides. And you see it as, I think, the Problem Solvers Caucus in the US and Congress is a great example of how you can have strong centrist voices in both parties coming together to offer solutions and then turning around to their own leaderships and saying, you have to use us, you have to work with us in order to deliver things.
Yeah, I love that, because I think that's a question a lot of people would probably have, particularly people who may not be as, doing politics as a job, I guess I could say. They're like, well, that sounds cool, but like, what, how does it work here? So I'm grateful that you mentioned the factional work, which is obviously, our theory of the case as well. If you build a strong center-left faction, then to your point, you have to be part of the Democrat, the party overall. Like the party overall essentially needs you to be able to win, which I think is important, especially emphasis on winning, right? So I want to take a step back because I really liked another element of your book where you talk about the politics of hope, and like hope being something that's very key to not only inspiring people to move on something, but also like, again, fighting extremism. Do you want to talk more about the politics of hope and how that can essentially play a role in building the strong center?
So look, I think it comes from, first of all, I should say it comes from the former chief rabbi of Great Britain, Jonathan Sacks, who was not only the chief rabbi of Great Britain, a great philosopher, but I think one of the great thinkers and writers of our time. And he talked about hope as what he called an active virtue. He differentiated it from optimism, which is a passive virtue, the belief that you wake up in the morning and the world will get better. And he said hope is an active virtue. It's something that makes you go out and work. And obviously, again, from an Israeli context, our national anthem is called Hatikvah, the hope. And so it has a special resonance for me. But why do I think hope is so important as a political concept? And any of us who've done any work in political communications will have been in an argument at some point about the fact that fear is a stronger driver of voters and is a more powerful political tool than hope can ever be. And I think it's just not true. There are plenty of examples where hope is successful as a political strategy. But beyond being helpful as a political strategy, it does something positive for society. You create a better society when you infuse people with a sense that things can get better and that you have a positive vision. So if the idea is to take out or to challenge some of the extremism, the pessimism, it's what Lee Drutman calls the cynicism and mistrust doom loop of politics, to do that, you have to offer a different kind of politics. So first, on just a practical level, when done well, hope wins and it's really successful. And I went back not long ago to Bill Clinton's speech in 1992 when he accepted the Democratic nomination for the first time. It was a speech that was just filled with this idea, with a positive vision for America. And Tony Blair's campaigns as New Labour had the same. And we've tried to do that here. And Macron has certainly done that in France. This idea that you can inspire people with a positive vision rather than just scare them about all the terrible things that might happen. So it works. But aside from that, it's actually really important for the kind of politics that we want to create. And if we want to create a politics that isn't so divisive, that doesn't drive people away from one another, we have to be able to offer something different. We are never going to be able to outfear the extremists. We're never going to be as good as they are. We're never going to go as far as they are. We're never going to say the crazy things that they say in order to drive people to feel a sense of fear and panic. Nor should we be trying to. The idea is not to emulate them. The idea is to try to do something different, something that works for us and for the kind of politics that we want. So that's where the idea of the politics of hope comes in. It ties into the thing I mentioned earlier about a liberal patriotism, an idea that we build a positive national story. It's good that you love your country. It's good that you feel a sense of pride. I know this is going to come out a few months after we talk, but we're talking now during the Olympics, and you can't help but feel a sense of pride when your country wins. And I saw the celebrations in St. Lucia when they won their first Olympic medal. It's good that people feel a sense of pride in their country. It's good that people feel a connection to it. And it can be a positive force. It can be something that unites us. We shouldn't have to wait 4 years for an Olympics for that to happen. We should be able to create that sense of a positive liberal patriotism all year round, and our politics can be a driving force for that. We have to avoid two traps that people sometimes fall into. There's the trap that I think the left sometimes falls into, which is a shyness or a bashfulness about patriotism and about loving your country. And certainly avoid the trap that the right falls into of patriotism that becomes a nationalism, that becomes a hatred of other people, a sense of superiority over other people, and then just can't help but be infused with racism and all the other things that come with it. So the concept of liberal patriotism is our way, as a centrist way, to reclaim something that's really important to people. It's a really cool part of people's identity, and fill it with something positive.
Absolutely. I mean, people talk about all the time how the Obama's campaign in '08 was, on the message of hope, right? And I think even to your point about fear, you can't outfear the extremes. I'm not going to, talk bad about any administrations and campaigns here, but like, there have been so many tactics of fear mongering from Democrats and Republicans. And it's like, God, like, how do you think that inspires anybody to get to the polls? Right. And mostly it probably keeps people, with their head under their pillow, like, I don't want to do anything because it's freaking me out on both sides. Right. So I will say, I think, perhaps with the new Democratic nominee, presidential nominee with Harris and her new VP pick, maybe we can kind of get past that on the Democratic side. I hope we don't keep the fear mongering tactics, because to your point, I don't think it's doing much for us. All things considered. So, but I do love the liberal patriot mention here, liberal patriotism, as to say, because you mentioned you saw that we had a conversation with Rui Teixeira, and his publication is called The Liberal Patriot, which I think is so fun because I don't think I've ever seen it used in other contexts aside from his publication. So that's really neat that it has its own brand, right? Can you maybe talk more about liberal patriotism in the lens, or in the frame of like healthy politics, right? Because I think your point about the Olympics is spot on, right? Like, you see on Twitter all the time, they're like, oh, I don't really like America until I see us on a world stage together. And it's like, well, why do we have that? Not me personally, obviously, I love America, but like, why do we have this sentiment of like, America sucks unless you're competing on, the uneven bars or whatever it is? You know what I mean? Like, I wonder why there's so much of that out there.
Yeah, I think it's largely a result of the kind of politics that we've had for so long, right? Politics that drives us into a cycle of negativity, the sense that everything's getting worse, it's always the other people's fault, everything's terrible. And that, look, I live in a country now where finding hope is difficult. We're in one of the worst years of certainly of my lifetime, if not ever, in terms of the history of the state of Israel. We're in a very difficult moment in terms of the Middle East in general. And sometimes it's hard to find that. And then you kind of see the Olympics and you see how much pride there is in an Israeli gold medal, how much it means to particularly small countries. By the way, you won't get this as an American. You top the medals table at every Olympics. But for us smaller countries, that sense of pride when there's a gold medal winner that creates something, a sense of anything is possible, right? And actually, when we do that, it's just much healthier for the country. Now, again, it can't just be restricted to sports and the Olympics. There are plenty of other opportunities to do it. And I think it does have to come from our politics. And sometimes when you talk about liberal patriotism, it seems like you're only talking about the way you portray yourself outwardly to the rest of the world. And it's really not about that at all. It's about how you portray yourself inwardly. It's about the things that you say to yourself as a country, what kind of national story you want to have, what kind of country you want to build, society you want to build. And I think that's really the core of what liberal patriotism tries to bring. When you combine that with the embrace of some of the words that I talked about before, moderation, pragmatism, nuance, complexity, and with a politics of hope, and a rejection of the extremes, and an embrace of liberal democracy, which goes hand in hand with these things. I really think, part of the negativity, I think, is a negativity about liberal democracy itself. It's failed. It's never going to be successful. It's too messy. It's too chaotic. Narratives, by the way, that are driven by non-democratic countries who are very keen to push those messages, and some of their allies within our countries, which is bizarre to me. When you put all those things together, you create, I think, for people a sense that there's something positive, there's something to look forward to, there's a reason to be hopeful about the future.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot because, sometimes it's a little bit of a bummer when you see it happening and playing out. But to your point, I do think politics needs to play more of a role in it. So I'm thinking now that you're talking about, the values of pragmatism and complexity, I'm wondering, so like, this is literally me like kind of forming this question in my head as I ask it, because I was thinking as you're talking, like something that I feel like we struggle with in America, particularly on the left, is articulating our values and why things should matter to people. We're very policy wonky in democratic politics, and I think we're improving in some capacities. But to your point about Bill Clinton, I think he probably was very less on the policy wonky and much more on the vibes, right? Like America, go us, whatever. So what I'm asking, I think, is how do we create not initially an agenda. I don't think I want to say that agenda, but like use that word, I should say. But how do we create something for the center left, for the center right, even that curates this value plus the agenda policy items that are going to matter to voters? Does that make sense? Like how do you create something that combines the values and the policy to help combat the polarization? And I say this also because Rob Willer was on, and he's leader of the Stanford Polarization Lab, and he was saying essentially when they do tests of different message testing in their lab, they talk about how someone can have very liberal policies, but if the candidate is talking about them through the lens of values of like family and care and empathy, again, to your point about the values in the center, they can win people over. So I don't know, have you participated in, seen anything in other countries or even ours of like how you articulate the values in a way that helps people understand why you're doing something and also includes policy? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. And I think it's a key question, right? Part of it is about emotion and about connecting with people. And one of the criticisms of centrism, I don't know if this is a uniquely left-wing problem, but certainly I think that the center has suffered with it sometimes is the sense that we don't connect well enough. And there's a few answers to that. There's a few solutions to that. The first is, I think you have to be really tuned into people's grievances to understand where they come from, right? Not to dismiss them, not to wave them away. If you're worried about immigration, you're a racist. If you're worried about globalization, you're a nativist. And if you're worried about technological progress, then it's because you're ignorant, right? If you just dismiss people without really taking the time to understand why they feel the way they do about an issue, why it's so important to them, why it drives that emotion in them, then I don't think you're ever going to be able to offer them solutions. The only way somebody will listen to your policy solution is if they think you really care. And the only way for them to think you really care, and maybe I'm in a minority in this, I have a lot of faith in the voting public. I think they can tell when someone's authentic and when they're not, and they appreciate authenticity, and they will know if you really care about them, if you really care about the issues that they care about. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with the populist message afterwards or prescription that comes afterwards, but the cost of entry in politics to offer a policy solution is first to have the basic level of empathy and care about the people that you're going to be impacting with your policy. So that's the first thing. And I don't think we necessarily always do that well enough. There's an example that I really like from President Macron's first election campaign, where he was talking to a group of factory workers, I think it was in France during the campaign. And you could tell they were angry and they didn't particularly take to him. And he just stood and listened and talked and engaged with them. And you could see the dynamic shift over the course of this scene. You could see how it got better as they listened to him and as he listened to them, more importantly. So that's the first one. The second thing is, look, we also have to do a better job at getting our message across in a way that works for the world that we live in. And sadly, that is a world of sound bites. And it is a world where we have social media algorithms that drive certain things. We can demand more of the media, by the way. Part of my commitment to a free press is also an understanding in the press that we can say to them, but you need to reflect these things better. And the other one is, you need to find a way to break through. And there's a great example, I think, from the last elections in the UK. The Liberal Democrat Party got 72 seats in the last election, so the third party, but a huge jump. They went from 8 seats to 72. The first thing they did that anybody noticed was their leader was kayaking and fell off into the water. And it became a hilarious moment that everybody thought was going to run and run and run until they realized it was part of a series of stunts. And he used that moment to talk about water issues. And then he did another stunt that allowed him to talk about another issue and another one. And he had moments of great seriousness. He has a child with special needs, and he spoke about him, about caring for him and the need for social care and better healthcare. And so there was very serious moments in the campaign, but he used moments of humor to break through the noise. And I think knowing how to combine those things, and it was an incredibly successful campaign that I think people can learn a lot from in terms of finding the way in a campaign that was, I think, without offending, hopefully either of the two big parties in the UK, was otherwise a little bit boring maybe. He came and did something completely different and got people's attention in a very positive way. So there are ways to break through, and then people will listen to our, very detailed policy papers and everything else. We had an advert in an election campaign that I was involved in here in Israel, where we'd written a very long manifesto. We were one of the few political parties that had invested the time. We realized that no one was talking about the manifesto because manifestos are boring. And so we actually had somebody sit and read the entire manifesto while somebody painted a mural behind him while he read the manifesto for it was about 3 hours, which was the longest you could do on YouTube at the time. And it was literally, the message was watching paint dry. Now, there wasn't a satire show that didn't talk about that ad afterwards. And what were they talking about? They were talking about the ad, they were talking about it being funny, and then they talked about the fact that we had a manifesto. It was a way to get policy through humor. So there are ways to break through. You just need to be creative.
That's awesome. Watching paint dry. I feel like we actually didn't get as much into some of the coalition building work that you've done. You don't have to go too in depth because I know we're a little bit on time, but can you talk a little bit more about some of the work that you've done? Because you've been in the thick of it, like in the streets doing stuff. Like the center is not just some academic thing. It's like it's a real tangible thing in your experiences. Do you want to talk more about that?
Sure. So look, one of the things that I've been saying as well is that we have to show our passion. We have to show that we care and we're as committed as people on the extremes, as people on the fringes. Now, there are times when that's difficult to do, and there are times when it becomes not easier, but the opportunity arises. Here in Israel, at the start of 2023, I served in the government that ended at the end of 2022, and a new government came in 2023, a government that was conservative, very conservative religiously, was very right wing, certainly has populist and extremist elements within it as well. That government set about trying to make sweeping changes to our judicial system, and were very clear that it was a part of a bigger plan to take apart, I think, our free press and everything else. And they were unashamed about their support for illiberal democracy, the kind of Orban style illiberal democracy here in Israel. And it was the political center really that took to the streets. And as I sit here with a shirt on and books behind me and talking about policy and principles and values, just over a year ago, me and my friends and my family were all out on the streets at 2:00 in the morning, blocking roads and saying, no, we're not going to let this happen. And going out week after week after week in rain, whenever we had rain here in Israel, and in the heat of the summer, protesting and saying, we're not going to let this happen. And it was the political center that came out and said, we're going to defend liberal democracy. By the way, that I think the protest movement in Israel won, and it did. The fight isn't over, but it won certainly the first round, was because the symbol of the protest movement became the Israeli flag. So that connection to liberal patriotism that said, we're fighting for something that is for our country, with a passion for our country. I think there's been similar things elsewhere as well. We're certainly not the only ones, but you have to show that you are as passionate and as committed to these values as people on the fringes are. And one of the places where, again, I know we talked about it a lot, but the issue of patriotism, I think, is a key one. I refuse to give grounds to anybody to the right of me on issues of patriotism. They do not love their country more than I love mine. And I think we need to be able to say that really clearly and really passionately. And the same has to be true when people are, laying out the sweeping criticisms of liberal democracy, which is the thing that you can blame for anything that doesn't work exactly the way you want it to work, to be as passionate in our defense of it and say, wait, is there a system of government that you would prefer to live in today? Because given a choice between living in a liberal democracy and living in an illiberal democracy, or living in a dictatorship, we know what really anybody listening to this conversation would choose. And they would choose in the end the freedoms that come with a liberal democracy, the opportunity that comes with a liberal democracy, the ability to succeed that comes in a liberal democracy that simply doesn't exist in those other systems. So we have to be clear that we're as passionate as our critics are, in defending the things that we believe in. And look, I was in a government that was made up of 8 political parties. It was an incredibly fragile coalition. It lasted a year and a half, and it was a difficult political challenge to set it up, led by Yair Zivan, by my boss, who created that coalition and was prime minister for part of the time. But one of the things that we're now saying to the Israeli public here is, wait, that was a good thing. We should be proud of that. Maybe not 8 parties, maybe we can make do with 4 or 5. But the fact that we managed to bring lots of people together and actually get stuff done, that's something we should take pride in and we should be positive about. And I think we're not always in the political center that great at celebrating our successes, saying, actually, we've done things that we can be really proud of. And we've done things that have made a tangible difference to people's lives and have made their lives better. And you know what? We're better at governing, and we're better at getting things done than the extremes and the fringes will ever be.
I'm going to let you have a mic drop on that one, because that was perfect. That was perfect. I so appreciate that, because I try to, play with the phrase, a passionate pragmatist, right? Because to your point, like, people are like, oh, everyone in the middle who's a moderate or who's a pragmatist or whatever you want to call us, like, there's no zeal, there's no passion, there's no energy. And it's like, no, there is. It's just we may, articulate it in a different manner than others do, but that doesn't mean it's not there. So I love that. I really, really appreciate that. You're so lovely. All right. So our final question is the one that we ask everyone. And it is, what is one depolarizing activity that listeners can partake in after listening to this podcast today?
Wow. Okay. So I'll say 2 if I can. The first one is, there's an essay in the book by Daniel Lubetzky. And Daniel Lubetzky writes that radicals wake up in the morning thinking about changing the world, and moderates wake up in the morning thinking about lunch. So don't think about lunch. Do think about lunch. It's an important meal. But think about changing the world. Think about getting involved, and actually realize that moderates and pragmatists, the political center, has to be active. We have to be involved in order to lead to depolarization, in order to be able to defeat the extremes and change the trend of politics. And the second one is a shout out to a startup actually that I met in New York when I was over in the US. I met with their team, and they're setting up. It's called Spread. It's a new kind of social media platform that is really just starting out, but the whole algorithm is meant to counter kind of algorithms that drive us apart on social media. And so it's a new type of a new approach to it, which is really trying to do something fundamentally different. It's really great, and they've let me have kind of access to it, so I've been using it. It feels entirely different to kind of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, in that there's just none of the kind of the clashes and the need to drive us apart that we see on some of those other platforms. So I think that there will be technological solutions to these, and hopefully that's one example. But there will be, and those people that are technologically better than I am should be looking to find the technological solutions as well to counter polarization. We're not going to roll the internet back, so we need to find the ways to make it work to our favor.
Well, you gave us a whole new app to use here, so like we appreciate that first and foremost. Get off Twitter and use Spread. That's the message. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's great. I appreciate that. Yair, thank you so much for joining us. This was absolutely wonderful. Again, I was so grateful to have been able to meet you in person a few weeks ago. Please come back and see us anytime. We appreciate you and the work that you're doing, and just want more yous out there doing this stuff.
Thank you very much.